Karen yells at man wearing Biden shirt, then learns he's the mayor. It was a hot afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day that made even the most mundane tasks feel like a challenge. People were bustling down the sidewalk, hurrying to their destinations, their faces etched with the exhaustion that comes with the midday sun. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of food trucks and the faint hum of traffic as it coursed through the downtown area. James had just finished a long meeting at City Hall, his shirt now clinging to his back as he made his way to the nearby coffee shop for a quick break. He was dressed simply, his Biden t-shirt a bold contrast to the sea of business attire that surrounded him. It was a political statement of sorts, but for James, it was just another day in the life of a public figure, navigating the streets like anyone else. As he entered the shop, he immediately noticed the buzz of conversation. People sat scattered at tables, sipping on iced lattes and engaging in low chatter. His eyes briefly scanned the room, searching for an empty seat when a voice cut through the air, sharp and unrelenting. "Hey, you can't wear that shirt in here." James turned his head, surprised by the sudden confrontation. Standing near the counter was a woman, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at him with disdain. She was dressed casually, but the contempt in her eyes was unmistakable. The shop's employees looked on, some avoiding eye contact, others frozen in place, unsure of how to react. The woman, who had to be in her mid-40s, stepped forward, pointing a finger directly at his chest. "I'm not serving you if you're going to wear that," she snapped. "This is a place for people who respect the country, not for those who want to make a political statement." James blinked, processing the words. He had lived in a city where politics were always a hot topic, but this level of hostility was new. He knew that wearing his political views on his sleeve might raise some eyebrows, but this was different. This woman wasn't just questioning his shirt, she was attacking him for it. "I'm just here for a coffee, ma'am," James said, trying to defuse the situation with a calm, collected tone. "I'm not here to argue," but she wasn't hearing him. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice growing louder, her face reddening as she pointed at the shirt. "You think this is funny? You really think you can walk around with that on and not cause problems? People like you are what's wrong with this country. You should be ashamed." The room seemed to fall silent. Every eye was on them now, some curious, some uncomfortable. James could feel the heat of the confrontation rising. He hadn't expected this type of reaction at all, not in a place like this. He had expected a casual walk-in, a simple coffee, and a brief escape from his busy day. But now it was clear that his shirt had become a symbol, one that apparently carried more weight than he realized. He took a deep breath, realizing this wasn't just about the shirt anymore. It was about the values that it represented, the people it divided. He considered walking out, just getting his coffee elsewhere, but something in him stopped. There was a moment of hesitation, a realization that perhaps he had a responsibility to stand his ground. But before he could respond, she was already speaking again, her voice a sharp edge cutting through the tension in the room. "You should take that off and leave," she demanded, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. James held her gaze for a moment. There was no way he was going to let her dictate how he expressed himself, especially not in a public space where freedom of speech was supposed to be protected. He wasn't about to back down, not just for himself but for the principles that this shirt symbolized. "I'm not going anywhere," James said calmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm just here to enjoy my coffee like everyone else." The woman didn't seem to like this response. She took another step forward, getting even closer, her finger still pointing at his chest. "Then you can enjoy your coffee somewhere else. I'm calling security if you don't leave." James' jaw tightened, and a part of him wondered if this confrontation was going to escalate even further. The eyes of the room were now on him, waiting for something to break the tension. What would happen next? Would the people around him side with the woman? Or would they stand by the man who simply wanted to exist in public without fear of confrontation? Just then, he heard the soft chime of the door as someone else entered the shop, oblivious to the brewing storm. James held his ground, but the tension was palpable. Would the situation escalate, or would he finally get that coffee and escape this strange battle? It was unclear. And James wasn't sure just yet how he was going to resolve this. James could feel the heat of the woman's glare bearing down on him as she stood before him, arms crossed tightly, her stance aggressive. The room remained silent, all eyes trained on the exchange. James noticed a few of the employees watching from behind the counter, their expressions a mixture of confusion and discomfort. It wasn't just him this woman was confronting. It was the tension that came with it, the line that was drawn between them. "Do you have any idea what that shirt represents?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "It's disrespectful. You're walking around like you're better than everyone else, flaunting your political views in a place like this. Do you have any respect for the people around you?" James' breath caught slightly in his throat, his jaw tightening. He didn't expect to be having a debate over politics today, certainly not here. But she wasn't backing down, and neither was he. He stood tall, his posture deliberate. Despite the growing tension, he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not trying to disrespect anyone," James replied, his voice steady despite the rising heat. "I just want a coffee. I'm not here to start an argument." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of disbelief. "You're not here to argue? Then why are you wearing that?" she snapped. "It's obvious you're looking for a fight. People like you don't belong here." The words stung more than James cared to admit. He didn't feel like he was looking for a fight. He was simply existing, wearing what felt right to him, expressing his support for his values. But to her, it wasn't just a shirt. It was a trigger, a reminder of everything that divided them. He took a slow breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had been in tense situations before, and he had learned that responding with anger only fueled the fire. He wanted to disengage, to walk away and leave the situation behind. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the principle of standing his ground, of refusing to be silenced by someone who didn't understand. Maybe it was the realization that his values were important, even if they clashed with the views of others. Whatever it was, it kept him rooted to the spot. "I'm not looking for a fight," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "I just don't appreciate being told how to express myself, especially not by someone who doesn't know me." She wasn't done. The woman stepped forward, closing the space between them, her face a mask of anger and judgment. "You're a disgrace to this country," she sneered. "You think wearing that shirt makes you some kind of hero? Doesn't. It makes you part of the problem. A problem that we don't need in here." James' fists clenched involuntarily, but he held his ground. This wasn't about the shirt. It wasn't even about the politics. It was about power, control, and the way some people thought they could dictate the behavior of others, especially when it came to something as personal as political expression. A few of the customers had started to glance nervously toward the door, sensing the rising tension, but no one dared to intervene. It was as though they were all waiting for something to break the impasse. But the woman wasn't done yet. She was on a roll, and the words came faster, more vicious with each passing second. "I bet you don't even know how to be civil. You probably think your opinions are superior just because you're wearing that. You're nothing but a puppet for the people you support. No better than the rest of the mindless drones that follow the same narrative. You don't deserve to be here." James felt the sting of her words, but he wasn't going to let them get to him. He knew who he was. He knew what he stood for, and he knew that her opinion, while harsh, didn't define him. He wasn't here for her approval. He didn't need to win her over. He just wanted to exist in the same space without feeling like an outsider. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly, but there was an edge to his words now. "I just want to live in a place where people can have different opinions and still coexist. It's what this country is supposed to be about, isn't it?" But the woman wasn't having it. She crossed her arms tighter, her face a picture of defiance. "No," she spat. "It's about respect. You don't get to walk in here with that shirt and think you're entitled to respect. You don't get to flaunt your agenda and expect everyone to be okay with it. You need to leave. Now." The words hung in the air, and the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The employees were now watching openly, some nervously glancing toward the door, others too afraid to intervene. James could feel his heart beating faster, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he refused to let it control him. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. He turned slowly to the counter, looking for the employee who had been standing there the entire time, silently observing the situation unfold. She avoided his gaze, but he could see the discomfort in her eyes. She was as stuck in this as he was. James finally sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I'm just here for a coffee, like anyone else." The woman's lips curled into a sneer, and she took a step forward, pointing toward the door. "I'll have you escorted out if I need to," she threatened. "I'm not letting people like you ruin the atmosphere here." But as she stood there, her finger jabbing toward the door, James realized something. This wasn't just about the shirt anymore. It wasn't even about the confrontation. It was about the power that people like her tried to wield over others, trying to dictate how someone could exist in a public space. And James wasn't about to let that happen. Not today. The tension in the coffee shop was thick, each second stretching longer than the last. James could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, but he refused to give in to the discomfort. The woman in front of him, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest, was relentless in her attack. The barista behind the counter nervously wiped down the same spot on the counter for the third time, clearly wishing this would end. But James wasn't the one to walk away. "You really think you can get away with this?" The woman spat, her voice rising once more. She didn't care about the stares of others, nor the increasingly hostile energy in the room. It was as though this moment was her stage, and she was determined to deliver the performance of her life. Walking around like you're superior to everyone else just because of a stupid shirt. James took another deep breath, trying to keep the burning frustration from spilling over. He could feel his hands clenching involuntarily, but he was determined not to lose control. "I didn't come here to argue," he said again, each word carefully measured. "I'm just here for a coffee." "Coffee?" she scoffed, the word coming out of her mouth like an insult. "You're not here for a coffee. You're here to provoke, to make everyone uncomfortable with your presence. People like you don't deserve to be here." It was almost as if she thought she could control his actions, dictate how he should behave. James understood the complexity of what was happening now. This wasn't just about the shirt or the current political divide. No, it was much bigger than that. It was about dominance, about power and control. She was trying to make him feel small, to force him into submission with her words. But James wasn't backing down. The others around them seemed to shrink further into their seats. It wasn't clear whether they agreed with the woman's sentiment or were just too uncomfortable to intervene. But James couldn't focus on them. His attention was locked on the woman standing before him, who had now taken a few steps closer, her eyes practically burning holes into him. "I don't know what kind of world you think you live in, but this isn't it. People like you have no respect. You think you can just do whatever you want without consequence, right?" Her voice had reached a crescendo now, louder than before, and more biting. James remained still, taking in her words but not letting them settle within him. He had heard it all before. People who thought they had the right to speak for everyone, to define what was acceptable and what wasn't. He wasn't about to let her dictate the narrative. "I don't think you get it," she continued, her face flushed with fury. "You're not just wearing a shirt. You're showing people who you are. And that's not someone I want to share space with." For the briefest moment, James felt the weight of her words. It wasn't just the shirt. It wasn't even about the politics anymore. It was about the fact that she had already decided who he was without even asking, without even trying to understand. She had built an entire narrative around the simple act of him wearing a shirt that represented something to him, something he stood by. And now she was determined to force him to bend to her will. "I'm not here to fight with you," he repeated, but there was a quiet resolve in his voice now. He wasn't giving in. "I'm just here to be," but she wasn't hearing it. Her eyes flashed with even more anger, as if his calmness was fueling her frustration. "You don't get to just be. You think wearing that shirt is some kind of statement of power?" She sneered. "You're nothing. You're just part of the problem, spreading hatred and division wherever you go." She didn't stop there. She took another step closer, her finger jabbing the air as she spoke, almost as though she was physically trying to push him out of the space. I don't care about your opinions, and I don't care about your stupid shirt. You're a disgrace, and I'm not going to stand here and let you ruin my day. James held his ground. He could feel the eyes of the other customers again, but this time he didn't care. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need her approval. He needed to stand tall, to be unshaken. Her hand shot out, as if to grab him, but he stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension in the air was palpable now, almost suffocating. The room had gone completely still, the sound of the coffee grinder humming in the background, the only noise breaking the silence. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly, the words now filled with purpose. His voice had a quiet authority, a strength that cut through the chaos. You can't tell me how to exist. It was then that the woman's expression shifted, the anger still there, but now mixed with something else, something darker. She was trying to assert her dominance, trying to force him to back down, and the fact that he wasn't complying seemed to fuel her frustration even further. She took another step closer, her face twisted with resentment. You think you're special, don't you? You think because you're wearing that, you can act however you want without consequences. You have no idea how disrespectful you are. But James knew better than to get drawn into her anger. He knew that the more he responded with calmness, the more it would get under her skin. Her rage wasn't really about him or his shirt. It was about the fact that she couldn't control him, couldn't make him bend to her views. It was about losing the grip on the narrative she had so desperately tried to control. I'm just a person, like anyone else, he said softly, his gaze unwavering. And I'm not going to let you tell me who I can be. But her voice wasn't done yet. The tension was building with every word, and James could feel it escalating. The woman's frustration had reached its boiling point. She could feel the anger pulsing through her veins, bubbling over with each word she threw at James. This wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. It wasn't even about the shirt or the politician it represented. No, it had become something much more personal. She felt like she was losing control of the situation, losing control of the narrative she had tried so hard to create. You think this is some kind of joke? She spat, her voice rising. People like you don't belong here. You don't belong in my space. You're disgusting, flaunting your divisive little opinions for the world to see. James stood firm, his back straight and his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't going to budge. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with this kind of person wasn't to engage with the anger, but to stay calm, to remain unshaken. He wasn't about to let her drag him into her emotional chaos. Her words kept coming, each one designed to wound, to push him into a corner, but he wasn't biting. He could feel the crowd's eyes on him, the discomfort in the air, but he didn't care. The longer this dragged on, the more ridiculous she looked, the more desperate she seemed. She couldn't understand how someone could just exist without conforming to her views, to her narrative. You have no respect for people who don't agree with you, she shouted, gesturing wildly. You're not here to have a discussion. You're here to provoke, to make people like me uncomfortable. You're not even human. With your self-righteous attitude and your smugness. James didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before. These were the same accusations people like her threw at anyone who didn't align with their worldview. It was all about control. It was all about forcing everyone to follow the same script, to wear the same uniform, to think the same way. And when someone dared to step outside of those rigid expectations, they were labeled as the enemy. I'm not here to hurt anyone, he said, his voice steady, despite the tension building around them. I'm here to be. I'm here to live my life. Her face reddened at his calmness, and her body language turned hostile. She took a few steps forward, closing the gap between them. It was clear now that she wanted to intimidate him, to make him feel small. But James wasn't backing down. He refused to shrink for her. He refused to apologize for being who he was, for wearing what he wore, for thinking what he thought. You think your little shirt makes you special? She snarled. You think you can just waltz in here with that, and no one will say anything? Well, guess what? Not everyone is as tolerant as you think. Not everyone is going to just let you do whatever you want. I'm not tolerating you. and neither is anyone else here. She wasn't just yelling at him anymore. She was yelling at everyone in the room. Her words were no longer aimed solely at James. They were a blanket condemnation of anyone who might think like him. The whole room could feel her rage, her desire to force everyone to see things her way. And yet, despite all the noise, James didn't falter. He didn't waver. He didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. "You're trying to make me the villain here, but I'm not the one causing the problems," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're the one creating division, not me. You're the one that's refusing to see that people can disagree, and that's okay." But that only seemed to infuriate her more. Her hands clenched into fists, and she stepped even closer, until they were almost nose to nose. The anger radiating off her was palpable now, but James remained unfazed. "You don't get to tell me what's okay," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "You don't get to walk around here wearing that and think you're entitled to peace. People like you deserve to be called out. You deserve to be made uncomfortable. And I'm the one to do it." Her face was contorted in fury, her eyes wide and wild. She couldn't accept that James wasn't reacting the way she expected. She couldn't accept that he wasn't shrinking, wasn't apologizing, wasn't begging her for forgiveness. She was desperate to make him feel small, to force him into submission. But James stood tall, unshaken, still holding his ground. "I'm not here to apologize for who I am," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to exist." It was almost as if his calmness, his refusal to be shaken, was making her lose control even more. She had expected him to flinch, to apologize, to back off. But instead, he stood there, unyielding, unmoved by her tirade. And the more she yelled, the more ridiculous it all seemed. "You're just a hypocrite. You know that?" she yelled, her voice growing hoarse from all the screaming. "You act like you're all tolerant and open-minded, but you're not. You're just like the rest of them. Selfish, self-righteous, and completely blind to everything that's wrong with this country." James felt the weight of her words, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter how hard she tried to make him feel like the enemy, because he knew who he was. He knew that her words couldn't define him, and he wasn't going to let her get under his skin. "I'm not your enemy," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "You're not my enemy. You're just angry, and that's okay. But you can't make me angry too." Her face twisted, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like realization, but it was quickly smothered by her own rage. She wasn't done yet. She wasn't ready to let go of her anger, of her need to make him feel small, to make him apologize. But James wasn't the one who was going to back down. He had already given her what she wanted: attention. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of watching him squirm, watching him apologize for being who he was. Not today. Not ever. The crowd around them had grown larger. Whispers and murmurs traveled through the air, the tension palpable. James could feel the eyes of onlookers on him, but it didn't faze him. It wasn't the first time he'd been the center of unwanted attention, but this time, something felt different. There was a sense of desperation in the air, as though this woman, this Karen, was determined to make him react, to make him feel small. She was relentless in her fury, her face reddening with every word. The louder she yelled, the more aggressive her gestures became. Her hands waved in the air like a conductor directing an orchestra of rage, each movement sharp and demanding. Every accusation she hurled at him was meant to provoke, to break his calm, but James remained as still as stone. "You really think I'm going to let you get away with this?" she barked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You think you can just wear that, walk into my space, and not face consequences? You're pathetic." James could see her pulse quicken, her breathing growing shallow. She was spiraling, unable to stop herself. It wasn't about the hat anymore, or even about him. It was about her inability to control the situation, her need to dominate. And the harder she tried, the more it became clear that she wasn't in control of anything. "People like you are the reason this country is falling apart," she spat, her voice thick with disdain. You think your little Biden-Harris hat makes you special? It makes you a target, that's what it makes you. You don't get to come in here, flaunt your politics, and not expect pushback. James didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. This knee-jerk reaction from those who couldn't stand the thought of someone differing in opinion, someone standing firm in their beliefs. She wasn't angry about his hat. She was angry that he wasn't backing down. She wasn't used to this. People like her didn't get challenged. They didn't have to face the uncomfortable reality that other people could hold different views and still be treated with respect. You're just looking for a fight, she continued, growing more agitated. That's all you want. You want to walk around with your little Biden-Harris nonsense and then play the victim when someone calls you out. Well, guess what? Not everyone thinks like you do. Not everyone cares about your little crusade. You think you can change people's minds with that hat? You're pathetic. James remained silent, refusing to feed into her tirade. He knew the power of silence in situations like this. The more she screamed, the more ridiculous she looked, the more out of control she became. He didn't need to argue with her. He didn't need to prove anything. His calmness was the answer to her rage. "You don't belong here," she shouted. "You don't deserve to walk around in my space. You don't get to make people feel uncomfortable, not without consequences." But James wasn't the one making her uncomfortable. He wasn't the one causing chaos. She was the one losing her grip on reality, unable to see that the problem wasn't him, but the way she had let her anger consume her. He could see it in her eyes now, the frustration, the desperation, the need to be right. She needed to win to make him back down, but James wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "Why don't you just leave?" she demanded, her voice rising even further. "You're not welcome here. You're making everything worse. You're the one causing all this drama, and I'm not going to stand for it." James stood tall, his back straight, his hands at his sides. He didn't need to raise his voice to make himself heard. His presence was enough. He was calm, and in this situation, his calmness was more powerful than any angry outburst she could muster. She was losing control, and James could see it. Her words were becoming less coherent, more desperate. She was unraveling, and the more she tried to pull him into her spiral, the more he resisted. He wasn't going to play along. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of reacting. He wasn't the one causing this chaos. She was. "You're just a coward," she spat, trying to provoke him. "You can't even defend your beliefs without hiding behind that stupid hat. You're weak. You're nothing." It was the last straw for her. She was throwing everything she had left at him, hoping something would stick. But James remained unaffected. He wasn't the coward. He wasn't the weak one. She was the one whose inability to control her emotions was dragging her into this ugly confrontation. "Why don't you leave before I get security?" she threatened, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going to stand here and let you disrespect me like this." Her threat only seemed to fuel her anger more, and the words began to come faster, more erratic. It was clear now, she wasn't angry about the hat. She was angry because he hadn't reacted the way she expected. She wanted him to cower. She wanted him to apologize. But James didn't care about her expectations. He wasn't there to please her. He wasn't there to make her comfortable. He was just there, standing his ground, refusing to let her control him. "You don't scare me," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You can shout all you want, but you're not going to make me feel small. You're not going to intimidate me." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, James saw a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. She hadn't expected him to stand so firm, so resolute. She hadn't expected him to reject her attempts to bully him into submission. And that was when it became clear she had no power in this situation. Her words were empty. Her threats were meaningless. She had no control over him. "You're just making yourself look pathetic," he continued, his tone calm but firm. "You're not even angry about the hat. You're angry because I'm not doing what you want. But that's not my problem. That's yours." And with that, he turned his back on her, walking away slowly, leaving her standing there in the middle of the room, her face contorted in frustration, her words still hanging in the air. She was the one who had lost control. She was the one who had let her anger destroy her sense of reason. And James, he was just the one who refused to give in. The tension in the room reached a boiling point as James turned his back to the woman. The room, once bustling with chatter and activity, had gone eerily silent. People were watching, some trying to act like they weren't. But the truth was that everyone was now paying attention to the escalating scene. James could feel eyes on him, but he didn't care. He wasn't about to let this woman's rage dictate his actions. "Where are you going?" she screamed, her voice cutting through the stillness. "You think you can just walk away like that? You think you can get away with this?" James didn't stop. He kept walking toward the door, his steps measured and confident. His posture hadn't wavered, and neither had his resolve. He wasn't afraid of her, nor was he afraid of the security guard who had just come to the scene. In fact, he wasn't afraid of anything at all. Behind him, the woman's voice grew louder, her anger more desperate. She wasn't used to being ignored, and certainly not to having her authority questioned. But that's exactly what was happening. In her frustration, she was slowly losing control, and James wasn't about to let her reclaim it. As he neared the exit, the woman's voice grew shriller. "You can't just leave like this," she demanded. "Do you know who I am? I'll make sure you never set foot in this place again." James paused just before stepping outside, his hand on the door handle. He could feel her gaze still burning into the back of his neck. She was trying so hard to regain some semblance of power, but it was too late. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Actually, I think you're the one who needs to be careful now." The words hung in the air like a heavy silence, and for a moment, the woman didn't say anything. James could sense her confusion, her disbelief at his response. She had expected him to apologize, to cower under her verbal assault. She had expected him to feel small and ashamed. Instead, he had remained calm, unaffected by her attempts to belittle him. And then, with a quiet, confident turn, he faced her. "I should have introduced myself earlier," he said, his voice still carrying the same unshakable calm. "But I think you've made enough assumptions about me already." Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the air seemed to still around them. "What are you talking about?" she sneered, her tone dripping with contempt. "You think I'm supposed to care who you are? You're just some guy in a hat. I don't have time for this nonsense." James let out a soft sigh, shaking his head slightly, as though disappointed by her lack of self-awareness. "No, I'm not just some guy in a hat," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "I'm the mayor of this town." The words hit her like a slap in the face, and for the first time, the arrogant mask she had worn so comfortably faltered. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if the realization of what she had just heard couldn't fully register. She took a step back, as if trying to process the information. The truth was, she couldn't believe it. She had been so sure of her righteousness, so convinced that she could take control of the situation just because she disagreed with his political views. But now, standing before her, was someone who had the power to change things, someone who could take action, someone who could expose the very hypocrisy she had shown by humiliating him in the first place. You're the mayor?" she stammered, her voice suddenly shaking. "No, no way. This can't be happening." James didn't answer immediately. He let the weight of his words settle in the room, let the significance of his revelation sink in. The woman's expression shifted between confusion, disbelief, and fear. She had gone from attacking him, assuming he was nothing more than an ordinary person she could push around, to realizing that she had just insulted the very person who held the keys to the town's future. "You made quite an assumption," he said, his voice still calm but now carrying a sharper edge. "I'm the one who sets the tone around here, and I don't take kindly to people disrespecting others based solely on their beliefs." Her eyes darted around the room, as though she were searching for an escape, a way out of the mess she had created. She had been so certain she could control the situation, but now it was spiraling out of her grasp, and she had no one to blame but herself. James took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes unwavering. "I don't care if you disagree with me," he continued, I don't care what political party you belong to, but you don't get to treat people like this, especially not in my town. People like you who think they can bully others into submission? You're the ones who are going to be left behind." The woman's face flushed a deep red, her hands shaking as she tried to come up with a response. But nothing came. She had no defense. Her attack on him had been petty and unfounded, based on nothing more than a single hat, a symbol she had decided to demonize. Now, facing the truth, she was speechless. James didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Instead, he turned back to the door, his hand resting on the handle once again. He had made his point, and he wasn't going to waste any more time on someone who had no respect for others. He had no intention of letting her off easy. But before he walked out, he looked back at her one last time, his expression hardening. "You're lucky you didn't ruin this place for everyone else today," he said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "But you've just learned what happens when you underestimate someone." With that, he stepped outside, leaving the woman standing there, her mouth still agape, unsure of how to respond. Her world had just been flipped upside down, and there was nothing she could do to undo the damage she had caused. As he walked away, James couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, unshaken, and had made sure she understood one simple truth. No one, no matter how loud they shouted or how much they tried to control the narrative, would ever have the power to break him. He had the strength to stand up, and he would continue to use that strength to make sure that people like her didn't get away with spreading hatred and division. The woman stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing in a futile attempt to formulate a response. The weight of James' words hit her with full force, and for a brief moment, she was left speechless. She had expected to be the one in control, but now, standing there in the midst of the crowd, she realized how completely she had miscalculated. As James stepped away from the door and into the daylight, the woman remained rooted to the spot, her anger shifting to something darker. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but it wasn't the same kind of fury that had driven her to attack him earlier. No, this was something else entirely. It was humiliation. It was the sharp sting of defeat. She turned slowly, scanning the faces around her, hoping to find support. But all she saw were a dozen sets of eyes, all trained on her now. Some faces held curiosity, others sympathy, and a few even a faint glimmer of amusement. The silence around her was deafening, and it only added to the growing discomfort she felt. "You all right there, miss?" A voice broke through the tension, a woman nearby who had witnessed the entire exchange. The woman's voice was laced with condescension, a thinly veiled reminder that she was the one who had made a scene, not James. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that, for the first time in her life, she had been on the wrong side of the equation. She had been so consumed by her political beliefs, so entrenched in her need to be right, that she had overlooked one simple, glaring truth: respect. She had shown none, not to James, not to anyone in the room, and especially not to herself. Her hands trembled, and she couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment that was beginning to spread through her chest. She had always prided herself on being assertive, on making her voice heard. But today, her words had done nothing but expose her ignorance. She had underestimated her target, and now everyone in the room knew it. The whispers started slowly, the soft murmur of the crowd as they began to share the same thought. She had been put in her place. The woman wasn't the only one feeling the sting. People around her exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and amusement. No one had expected that moment to unfold the way it had. No one had expected her to be so utterly humiliated in front of a crowd, by someone she had so confidently dismissed just moments before. She clenched her fists at her sides, her face flushing a deep shade of crimson. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though she could barely catch her breath. She had to do something. She had to regain some sense of control. But deep down, she knew it was too late. The damage had already been done. And then, as if to add insult to injury, the security guard approached her. His steps were slow, deliberate, and as he came into view, the weight of his presence made her heart skip a beat. She knew what he was going to say. She could already hear the words in her head, but somehow, when he actually spoke, it was even worse than she had imagined. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave," the guard said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't raise it. There was no need. The crowd's disapproval had already made her feel like a pariah. "What? You can't be serious," she snapped, her voice a weak protest in the face of the inevitable. She had never imagined that her day would unfold like this, that she would be asked to leave by security for something so trivial, so petty. But here she was, on the wrong side of the law and the wrong side of the crowd, with no way to defend herself. "I'm serious, ma'am," the guard said, his expression unwavering. "We're not having this kind of scene in here. I'm afraid you'll have to go." Her chest tightened. She had been a loud voice in this place, and now that same voice was falling silent. She was being escorted out, not for anything she had done wrong in the grand scheme of things, but for the way she had treated someone she knew nothing about. The irony was too much to bear. How had she allowed herself to sink so low? As the security guard motioned toward the door, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The whispers continued, but they were no longer about the situation. They were about her. They were about her humiliation. She was the one being escorted out, not James. She was the one who had to retreat, not him. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her shoulders like a boulder. She took one last look around, hoping to see some sign of sympathy, but none came. The eyes that had once been fixed on James now followed her every step as she was led out of the door. Each pair of eyes seemed to say the same thing. She had lost. And in that moment, she knew she had. The door swung closed behind her with a finality that rang louder than any words could. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the cold glass, staring back at the crowd she had once felt so certain would support her. But now, there was nothing but silence. She was alone, and she had no one to blame but herself. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of true shame. Not the kind of shame that came from losing an argument, but the kind that came from realizing that she had lost more than just a disagreement. She had lost the respect of those around her. She had lost her dignity. And in the end, it wasn't just about the hat or the words exchanged. It was about the way she had treated someone as if they were beneath her, only to find that, in the end, she had been the one to fall. The days following the incident were quieter than she had anticipated. The woman, who had once been a loud voice in the store, now walked past it with her head down, feeling the weight of her own arrogance. Her reputation, once unshakable, had crumbled in the blink of an eye. People who had known her for years now looked at her with subtle judgment, no longer offering her the same respect they once did. In the weeks that followed, she found herself avoiding the store, unable to face the memories of that humiliating day. It wasn't just about the public defeat. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to become someone she was not proud of. Her refusal to back down, to see the bigger picture, had cost her not only a personal defeat, but a lesson in humility that she would never forget. As for the man in the Biden shirt, the one she had so cruelly tried to put down, he continued on with his life, unaffected by the incident. His position as mayor was secure, and the attention the encounter had garnered only seemed to reinforce his standing. He went about his days with quiet confidence, while the woman's life seemed to unravel slowly but steadily. The incident had left a mark on her, one that was impossible to erase. The realization that she had attacked someone simply for their beliefs, that she had misjudged him based on a piece of clothing, sat with her like a constant ache. She had been so wrapped up in her own perspective, so sure of herself, that she failed to see the larger picture, the consequences of her actions. As for the store, business continued as usual. The employees who had witnessed the incident no longer spoke of it, but the memory lingered in the air, like an invisible cloud that hovered just out of reach. It was a reminder of how quickly power could be taken away, how easily a person's world could be turned upside down by their own actions. The woman had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. And she had lost it not because of her beliefs, but because of how she chose to express them. It was a lesson she would carry with her, one that would shape her future interactions with others. In the end, there was no grand apology, No sweeping gesture to make things right. The damage had been done, and the only thing left was for her to pick up the pieces of her pride and move forward, knowing that some mistakes couldn't be undone, no matter how hard you tried.